Hi everyone, in this video we are going to be unpacking the characters in Jane Harrison's play Rainbow's End. Now before we get started, it's really important that if you're studying this play with the aim of writing about it, that you keep in mind that characters aren't people, and that when you write about them, you need to write about them as constructions by an author. Now an example of what that would look like would be, rather than Nan is, you might say Nan is presented as or characterized as. Right, so really understanding and being able to write about them in that way is going to elevate your analysis. So let's get stuck into characters. We are going to start with Nan Dear, who is the matriarch of the Dear family. She is in her 60s and she has therefore experienced a wealth of trauma as a result of government policy in particular. She is very pessimistic, and as we know by studying some of the history that it's quite realistic to be pessimistic in her situation. She's very skeptical and critical of the government. She's very wary of white people, and she's very wary of institutions in general in this country. For example, she's very skeptical of hospitals, the Queen. She's very skeptical of Errol. She doesn't like the inspector. She's very much wanting the family just to be left alone. And I've put some quotes there from the play so that you can use them as evidence. She's also very wary of any promises given by the government, such as their promise of a housing development called Rumballara. She would rather sink or swim on her own in the flats, and she also bitterly and ironically references legislation like the New Deal, where Aboriginal people were promised better housing that never eventuated. She was raped by a white man and had her daughter taken from her, and that daughter is Gladys. She is very intelligent, very perceptive, and she is literate, which is a result of living on Kamaraganja at one time. And you can go back to the context video to learn a little bit more about Kamaraganja. She is very passionate towards her community, and that the trauma that many of those in the community are experiencing, this is seen in the way that she respects and expects Dolly to respect the cork tree men as well. As I said before, she was raped by a white man, and this is a family secret. It is not known to any of the characters until it's revealed later in the play, and this is her way of shielding her family. And in general, Nan tries to protect her family from what she calls grown-up business. And this is something that Harrison also remarked on when she was interviewing people who lived on the flats during this time, that despite the poor conditions, for a lot of the children, they were shielded from what was called grown-up business so that they could try and be as happy as possible. Now, Nan Dear also reflects some of the traditional gender roles at the time, and she mentions phrases like men's business and women's business a lot. And when Gladys tries to be quite outspoken at times, Nan is very quick to try and put her back in her place. She also celebrates Papa Dear's work, and I suppose from our end, Nan's work in trying to keep the family together and safe and happy is never really acknowledged by anyone, let alone herself, and instead she really celebrates Papa Dear's work in the community. Within the family, she also is the one who maintains culture, and this is through things like food or storytelling, pride in her culture, and she also is very proud of living where she lives and being from the Murray as well. She also helps us as the audience by providing some important background information. So she talks a lot about Kamaraganja, she talks about Rumballara, she mentions the New Deal, she talks about some of the historical things, and that's Harrison's way of really trying to get us up to speed throughout the play. Nan's language, so again, remembering that she is a construction, the language that Harrison uses for Nan is very opinionated and very candid. I found her quite a funny character when I was reading her because she is very blunt in her assessment of things, and her language also reflects her lack of formal education. And I thought this here captures her quite well, where she says, "Ask Errol here what it says in that there in Cyclops." So instead of saying encyclopedia, she says encyclops, which sounds, she doesn't know the word encyclopedia. It reflects that formal education. But it's actually very clever, because what she's saying to Gladys is, well, what do you think it's going to say in this encyclopedia that's representative of white education? What do you think it's going to say in there about us? Because I promise you it's not going to be anything good. Gladys is Dolly's mother. It's really important that although this is a Dear family, Gladys's last name is actually Banks. She's in her 40s, and unlike Nan, she is an optimist. She was stolen from her family and forced into domestic service, and as a result, she never received a formal education and is therefore illiterate. For her, this is a really great source of shame. At the beginning of the play, she is an enthusiastic royalist. She is very excited to go and meet the Queen. She has quite a complex relationship with whiteness in that she certainly experiences trauma and the effects of institutional racism, but she also values what she believes assimilation and whiteness in general can do for Dolly. She wants Dolly to read these encyclopedias so she can score better in school. She wants her to get a job that is viewed and valued by other white people. She wants her to marry Errol and join a white family. Like I said before, she's very ashamed of her illiteracy and her lack of education, and Price puts it well here when he says that it stands between her and the capacity to fully engage with the institutions that rule her life. Despite this lack of education, she is extremely intelligent, and again, if we think of her as a construction, Harrison shows this by having her often finish other people's sentences, by participating very successfully in quizzes from home, and she also really outmatches other characters like Errol in conversation. In terms of her place in the play and her role, she is a nurturer and also a pioneer for the community. And as the play progresses, we really see that pioneer part of her come to the fore. She becomes very empowered to advocate. She attends a council meeting about Aboriginal housing, and she presents a petition in Papa Dear's absence. And to really illustrate her growth and her developing literacy, she actually reads that petition out loud. Her language, in contrast to Nan's, is very optimistic, and we see that reflected all the way through. She's very excited about progress, excited about change, optimistic about what it will mean for her and her family. And if we look at the end of the play, the language in her speech is very fiery, very passionate. She even corrects the script in places in order to be more assertive, which I think is really interesting of her and representative of her development. I thought this was a really good illustration here of the difference in language that's used between Nan Dear and Gladys, where you have Nan's real skepticism and wariness and pessimism contrasted really well with Gladys's optimism. And you can see where I've highlighted Gladys's language here. Let's take a look at Dolly. She is the youngest in the family. Her full name is actually Dolores, and she is a teenager. She is very sheltered by her family, at least in the beginning of the play, and we talked about that notion of grown-up business before, and Dolly is very excluded from that, even though she certainly experiences racism. Very high achieving, very educated. She has great grades. We hear that she's very good at algebra. She gets awards for things like her punctuality, and she even gets a scholarship to study to be a nurse. Like I said before, she very much feels the impact of racist institutions and individuals, even if she doesn't necessarily understand or is privy to all of the detail. She's also very independent and self-assured, and if we think about Dolly as this younger character, I think she does reflect some of Harrison's hope in the younger generation to make things better. Now, there's a study guide that puts it really well, and I've put a link to it below, and they say that Dolly embodies the bridge between the prior generation's traditional views and the new generation's aspirations. And we see that reflected in the dream sequences that Dolly has. She's very torn between her dreams and reality. I've put some examples here of what that looks like in the play, most notably with the magazines. The study guide also had this incredible passage, so I thought I would put it here in full, and it talks about Dolly's character arc revealing her identity, where she has to balance the expectations of her family with also her personal ambitions, also against this society that really is resistant to her succeeding. So feel free to pause here for that in more detail. Now let's take a look at Errol. He is Dolly's love interest, and he is described by Harrison in the character description as being 20-ish and a white fella. His parents, we find out, are German immigrants who experienced racism on arrival, but we really don't meet or hear much more about what that was like in his family. He is a very nervous, awkward, bumbling, fumbling kind of character who comes across as very sheltered and ignorant. He says things like, it's like your family's from another country or something. You know, he's not aware of the political landscape in which he lives. He is educated, but certainly not worldly. He often offends characters in the play, Koori characters in the play, and he's often outwitted by them as well. Price puts it well when he says that he is a white man unaware of the racist institutions that shape and limit the lives that the women lead. And this is evidenced in the encyclopedias. He reads from a script in trying to sell them to the Dear women. He believes that they will set the children up on a lifelong love of learning and help with their assignments and help them to reach their full potential, and really shows that he has no understanding of the constraints that are limiting their potential in the first place. He also, when he's asked about what it says in them about Aboriginal people, he really doesn't know, and he says he thinks it'll be a really great entry in there. He is very naive as well, particularly when he is pursuing Dolly. He thinks that she can do whatever she wants in the future, and he says things like, you know, you've got all these cousins, what does that look like at Christmas? How many presents do you get? And come to the dance with me. He has no understanding of what the world looks like for Dolly. He also really mimics and I think represents the institutional racism, or perpetuated, I suppose, by common people at the time, in that he mimics those paternalistic beliefs that Aboriginal people are lesser than and need saving. The Insight Study Guide put it really well here when they said that his blunders suggest a greater need for sensitivity to the political implications of language, which I think are really interesting as well. If we're thinking about Errol as providing a role for Harrison, thinking about him as a construction, this is really helpful to think of as well. Now, in terms of Errol's family, we hear that he has quite a distance with his own family. We don't get a lot of detail, but we do get the sense that he loves the Dear women because of their closeness, and that's not something he has grown up with. He says that his dad expects him to call him sir. He also reinforces traditional views on gender with this idea that he can come in and save Dolly and take her away. And we also find out that his dad believed that his mum should stay at home, should not be employed, and she should just do the baking and the dusting. By the end of the play, and this is what I love about what Harrison's done with the character of Errol, is that we see this real growth in him from the beginning to the end of the play. He really learns from his missteps, he takes on criticism, and he really grows. For example, when he hears that Gladys is illiterate, he teaches her to read and write, and he does that in a really empathetic and kind way. He works really hard to prove to Dolly that he can change and learn and be different, and acknowledges that he has made mistakes. I think here, if we think about what role Errol plays and what Harrison achieves through him, I think he represents her hope for Australian society, that they can learn and grow and develop if they are open to it. And I've highlighted here just a couple of scenes from the beginning and the end of the play that I think capture some of Errol's growth and his beliefs about what the flats represent in terms of home. Now, Papa Dear, he is Dolly's grandfather-ish, and I will come back to this in a moment, and he is absent from the play. So he is spoken about a lot, but he is not seen on stage. So he is Nan's husband. He is believed to be Gladys's father and Dolly's grandfather. However, we find out that because Nan was raped by a white man, he is indeed not Gladys's father, and that's the big family secret that's revealed towards the end of the play. He is a travelling pastor. He's also a political activist for the Koori people living on the flats, and he's working really hard to try and better their living conditions and their opportunities. His hard work requires that he is away from the family, and that is really, I suppose, Harrison's attempt to embody the sacrifice of leaders at the time, the things that they gave up in order to try and better their communities. He's spoken about very highly by both the Dear women as well as the inspector, which I found quite interesting. And he's also a reminder of Nan's traditional views on gender, that she celebrates his being away doing men's business and that she's quite happy to pick up the domestic work at home. Now, the inspector, he is played by Errol. So we talked about before in the structure video that there are very few actors and that Errol actually takes on quite a few different roles in the play. And Price puts it well here when he says that whatever the capacity of Errol to question his own racist assumptions, he is nonetheless the product of the community and the privileges that he embodies. So he is essentially still white despite how much he grows. And I think it's interesting, therefore, that he represents all of these other white characters. So the inspector, he really embodies the aggressive policing that we talked about in the context video and the control that government had over Koori people. He has an explicitly assimilationist agenda, so he believes that Aboriginal people should just assimilate into white culture, and he even really patronisingly tries to explain that to the Dear women. The Dear women also fear him, and they fear that what he can do in terms of taking Dolly away or worsening their lives on the flats. And he promises, really grandiosely, he promises improvements and says that Rumballara is essentially going to fix all of their problems. And he says that in a way that really doesn't recognise the reason they have these problems in the first place. The bank manager, also played by Errol, he is polite in a way, but also very officious and pompous, very condescending. And he captures the view that a lot of white Australian people had towards Koori people at the time, and thinking that they weren't good enough, that they weren't going to be punctual, they're not smart enough. So a lot of really negative stereotypes. He's really shocked that Gladys has never been into a bank or even used one. He tries to encourage her to save up her pennies. But then he's also really resistant to employing Dolly because she's Aboriginal. So he's happy to benefit from them, but not happy to support them. He says things like he's unsure how Dolly would really fit into the bank culture, and questions things like her reliability and ability to get on with customers. He represents the institutions that really stand between Koori people and their dreams. Mr. Coody, he is the rent collector, again played by Errol. Doesn't have a massive role in the play, but he is very arrogant. He is a very patronising government official and very prejudiced against Aboriginal people. An example of this is the stage direction where he looks at Dolly's pregnant belly with disdain. He is the naked emblem of the policies created by white institution. He wants to police every move that the family makes, and he really revels in his position of power over them. And I've got some quotes here from the play that really capture that. The Jungi, the policeman, also played by Errol, also has a very small role in the play. He arrives to evacuate the women in the flood. He is very impersonal and cold in the way that he does this. There's very little empathy or understanding that this is a traumatic experience. And I've got some quotes there to really illustrate what that looks like. He also disregards the property that the women have and the possessions that they have. He questions whether putting a sewing machine, taking that with them is even worthwhile. He says that we need to move people. He puts the encyclopedias on the ground. And while on one hand this may seem rational, he's got to evacuate people, they're more important than possessions, it's also reflecting that he doesn't understand how hard the family has had to work for these possessions and that they can't easily be replaced like he suggests. Now, there are some other characters littered throughout the play, and these are also played by Errol. And I've pulled this whole section from the study guide by Price because I think, honestly, there's no point me trying to capture this in any other way. And that these antagonistic characters, they are reflective of all of the barriers and the obstacles that are faced by the women. So pause here for the brilliant passage here by Price. I hope this was helpful. I hope you now have a broader understanding of each character. Remember, characters aren't people, they are constructions. And if you have any questions, post them in the comments below. Bye.